The HOA president pointed straight at me and told the deputy, "He's trespassing on HOA property." Judging by the faces around my front yard, everyone believed her. Neighbors I'd waved to for years stood quietly behind the fence, some already recording with their phones, waiting to watch a retired old man lose an argument he supposedly couldn't win. 15 minutes later, nobody was looking at me anymore. They were all staring at a single parcel number printed on the paperwork in Vanessa Whitmore's hands. My name is Daniel Mercer. I spent 31 years wearing a Cedar County Sheriff's badge, and if those years taught me anything, it was this. People rarely create their biggest problems by lying. They create them by becoming absolutely certain they're right. That certainty rolled into my driveway just after 7 on a cool spring morning. 3 black SUVs crunched across the gravel as the fog drifted lazily over Cedar Pine Lake. I had been standing on my porch with a mug of black coffee, enjoying the quiet my late wife Eleanor loved so much. Then the engines shut off. Vanessa stepped out first, wearing a cream-colored blazer and carrying a leather portfolio against her side like a lawyer walking into court. 2 HOA board members followed. Behind them came a private security contractor carrying a tablet. Another man unloaded a large laminated map from the back of one of the SUVs. It wasn't an angry crowd. It was a confident one. That made it far more dangerous. Vanessa walked through my gate without asking permission and stopped halfway across my yard. "Daniel Mercer," she announced loudly enough for every neighbor to hear. After repeated violations and multiple ignored compliance notices, the Cedar Ridge Board has voted unanimously to remove you from HOA property. I took another sip of coffee before answering. "Morning, Vanessa." My calm response irritated her more than an argument would have. She smiled toward the neighbors instead. "You see? This has been his attitude from the beginning." Several people nodded. One man quietly muttered, "About time." Vanessa opened her portfolio and removed a stack of documents. We followed every required procedure under the CC and RS, certified notices, inspection requests, due process. Our attorney reviewed every step before today's enforcement. It sounded convincing. If I'd been standing on the other side of the fence, I might have believed her too. Then she pulled out her phone and placed the call on speaker. The dispatcher asked whether anyone was injured. No. Whether anyone had made threats. No. Whether weapons were involved. No. "So this is a civil property dispute?" the dispatcher asked. Vanessa answered without the slightest hesitation. "No. It's criminal trespassing. He's refusing to leave HOA property." I quietly memorized every word. Experience had taught me that the most important statement in an investigation is often the one someone delivers with complete confidence. 15 minutes later, Deputy Luke Barrett turned into my driveway. He stepped out of his patrol SUV, removed his sunglasses, and didn't say a word. Instead, he looked. Vanessa, the board members, the security contractor, the neighbors recording, the security cameras mounted beneath my porch roof. Finally, he looked at me. "Good deputies observe before they conclude." Vanessa reached him before he reached me. "Deputy," she said, handing him the leather portfolio, "everything you need is right here. The HOA has already established ownership." Luke accepted the folder but didn't open it. "Have you?" he asked. Vanessa smiled confidently. "Absolutely." Only then did he open the first page. He read it once. Then he quietly read it again. That tiny pause was almost invisible, but after 31 years wearing the same uniform, I recognized it immediately. Something didn't fit. Vanessa mistook the silence for agreement. I recognized it as doubt. I set my coffee mug on the porch railing and walked down the steps. There would be time for deeds, time for surveys, time for lawyers. Before any of that mattered, there was only one question worth asking. "Deputy," I said calmly, "before anyone decides who belongs here, did anyone verify the parcel number?" Deputy Luke Barrett didn't answer my question. He looked down at the paperwork in Vanessa Whitmore's hands, read the first page again, then quietly turned back to the beginning. That was the first moment something changed. Most people didn't notice it. I did. Good deputies don't reread paperwork unless the story on the page stops matching the story in front of them. Vanessa mistook his silence for agreement. She turned toward the neighbors and smiled with the confidence of someone who believed the difficult part was already over. "As everyone here knows," she said, projecting her voice toward the small crowd, "the association has spent months trying to resolve this peacefully. Mr. Mercer has ignored repeated certified notices, refused inspections, and continued violating community standards. A man near the mailbox nodded. She sent him plenty of warnings. Another homeowner quietly added, "Nobody gets this many notices unless they're in the wrong." I couldn't blame them. They were reacting to confidence, not evidence. Luke finally looked up. "Mrs. Whitmore, how long has Mr. Mercer lived here?" She frowned slightly. "I'm not sure why that matters." "Because I'm asking." "Several years." "How many?" "I don't know exactly." Luke nodded once. "Did your board verify ownership through the county recorder before beginning enforcement?" "We verified ownership through HOA records." "County records?" She hesitated just long enough for the neighbors to notice. "The HOA maintains the official community map." One of the board members immediately stepped forward and unfolded the laminated map across the hood of Luke's patrol SUV. Bright colors, thick boundary lines, Cedar Ridge's logo across the top. It looked impressive. It looked official. It looked exactly like the kind of document people stop questioning the moment it's laminated. Luke studied it carefully before asking another question. "Who prepared this?" "The original developer." "Recorded with the county?" Vanessa smiled politely. "Deputy, every board has relied on this map for years." Luke didn't return the smile. "That's not what I asked." The conversation paused. Behind Vanessa, the private security contractor slowly lowered the tablet he'd been holding since arriving. Even he seemed interested in the answer. Luke traced one finger along the lower edge of the map until he found the small print. Then he looked back at Vanessa. "Do you know whether this is a recorded survey or a planning exhibit?" The confidence on her face flickered for just an instant. "It's the official HOA map." Luke nodded again. Still not the same answer. A few neighbors exchanged uncertain glances. One woman quietly lowered her phone, no longer recording the confrontation she'd expected to watch. Luke closed the folder and turned toward me. "Mr. Mercer, did you receive every notice in this file?" "Every one." "Did you respond?" "Every one." Vanessa laughed softly. "His responses never addressed the violations." "No," I said calmly. "They addressed the property." Luke looked back at me. "What do you mean?" "Every certified response asked exactly one question." "Which was?" I looked directly at Vanessa before answering. "Please verify the recorded legal description attached to the parcel you're accusing me of occupying." Luke opened the folder one more time. His finger stopped on the parcel number printed at the top of the first notice. Then he compared it with another page farther back. He didn't say anything, but I watched his expression change almost imperceptibly. After 31 years wearing a badge, I'd learned that investigators rarely reveal what they're thinking until they're certain. Vanessa noticed the pause too. "Deputy," she said confidently, "if there's a clerical typo somewhere, it doesn't change the fact that he's standing on HOA property." Luke slowly closed the folder and looked directly at her. "Maybe." He let the single word hang in the quiet morning air. "Or maybe." His eyes returned to the parcel number one last time. "It's the only fact that matters." For the first time that morning, Vanessa Whitmore didn't answer immediately. It lasted less than a second, but after 31 years in law enforcement, I'd learned that hesitation often arrives before the truth does. Deputy Luke Barrett noticed it too. Instead of handing the folder back, he tucked it under one arm. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said evenly, "before I ask anyone to leave this property, I'd like to verify a few things." Vanessa gave a polite laugh. "Deputy, there really isn't anything left to verify. The board settled this months ago." "The board may have." Luke's voice never changed. "The county hasn't." The words settled over the yard like the morning fog still hanging above the lake. The neighbors stopped whispering. One by one, several lowered their phones. This wasn't unfolding the way anyone expected. Vanessa recovered quickly. "Our attorney reviewed every enforcement action before we got here today." "What's your attorney's name?" Luke asked. "Our outside counsel." "Name?" She hesitated again. "I'd have to check the file." Luke wrote a single line in the small notebook tucked into his shirt pocket. He never questioned her answer. He simply wrote it down. I'd seen that technique hundreds of times during my own career. Silence has a way of making confident people keep talking. Vanessa proved the point almost immediately. "Deputy, regardless of the paperwork, the violations are obvious." She pointed toward my dock. "That structure has never passed HOA inspection." "That's true," I replied. She smiled instantly. "Thank you. It has never passed an HOA inspection. I continued. Because nobody from the HOA has ever had authority to inspect it. Her smile disappeared. Luke looked toward the dock, then back at the folder. Do you have inspection reports? Vanessa confidently opened her portfolio. She removed photographs, board meeting minutes, certified mail receipts, copies of violation notices. Page after page crossed the hood of the patrol SUV. Then her movement slowed. She searched the folder again, more carefully this time. Finally, she looked up. He refused inspection. Luke nodded. Then there wouldn't be inspection reports. Correct. So how were the violations confirmed? Nobody answered. One of the board members quietly stepped backward. The private security contractor slipped his tablet into its case without saying a word. Even the neighbors could feel the conversation changing. This wasn't about faded paint anymore. It wasn't about my mailbox or my dock. It was about how the HOA had reached its conclusions in the first place. Luke closed the folder again. Mrs. Whitmore, he said calmly, I'm not asking whether. The board believed it had authority. He paused just long enough for everyone to focus on his next sentence. I'm asking how the board verified it. Another silence. Longer this time. Across the road, I noticed an older homeowner slowly fold the copy of an HOA newsletter he'd been carrying. Earlier, he'd looked convinced I was the problem. Now he looked uncertain. I leaned against the porch railing and remembered the first afternoon Rachel Sloan spread the HOA letters across my dining room table. She hadn't started by reading the violations. She hadn't asked about the fines. Instead, she'd picked up the attached map, studied it for several seconds, and asked a question so simple I almost laughed. Daniel. She tapped the corner of the page with one finger. Before we decide whether this map is accurate. She looked up at me. Let's find out whether anyone ever proved it was the right map to begin with. Deputy Luke Barrett rested Vanessa Whitmore's folder on the hood of his patrol SUV and looked at the laminated map again. He didn't speak for several seconds. Instead, he studied it the same way experienced investigators study a witness who seems just a little too rehearsed. Finally, he pointed to the title printed across the top. Mrs. Whitmore, he asked, where did this map come from? Vanessa answered immediately. It's the official Cedar Ridge community map. Luke nodded politely. I understand that's what you're calling it. He tapped the lower corner with one finger. I'm asking who created it. The original developer. Do you know when? Years ago. Do you know whether it was ever recorded with the county? Vanessa folded her arms. Deputy, every board has relied on that map since Cedar Ridge was established. Luke looked at her without changing expression. That's the fourth time you've answered a different question. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. The neighbors who had arrived hoping to watch a quick confrontation were now watching an interview they hadn't anticipated. A woman standing near the road quietly lowered her phone. An older man removed his sunglasses, leaned forward, and stared at the map instead of at me. Even the private security contractor shifted uncomfortably. Luke carefully picked up the laminated sheet and turned it over. Blank white backing. No county recording stamp. No surveyor's certification. No filing reference. He turned it back and studied the fine print running along the bottom edge. Who printed this version? Vanessa looked toward one of the board members before answering. The association office. From an original? Yes. Do you have the original? I'm sure we do. Have you seen it? She hesitated. Not personally. Luke made another note in his notebook. It wasn't a dramatic moment. Just one short sentence written on a small page. But I'd spent enough years writing reports to know that investigators don't write things down because they're convinced. They write them down because they don't want to forget what still needs proving. The private security contractor quietly cleared his throat. Vanessa turned toward him before he could speak, but it was already too late. Mrs. Whitmore, he said cautiously. I think the engineering firm referred to that as a planning exhibit. Vanessa's head turned sharply. That's not relevant. He immediately fell silent. Luke didn't. Planning exhibit, he repeated. The contractor shifted his weight. I'd have to see the original project file to be certain. Luke nodded. I'd appreciate that. Vanessa stepped forward before anyone else could speak. Deputy, we're getting distracted. This association has enforced these boundaries for over a decade. Maybe, Luke replied calmly. But enforcement doesn't establish ownership. Nobody said a word. The sentence seemed to echo across the quiet front yard. For the first time all morning, several neighbors weren't looking at Vanessa anymore. They were looking at the map. That was the exact moment I realized the balance had started to shift. People hadn't stopped trusting Vanessa because of something I said. They'd stopped trusting the document she'd trusted without questioning. Luke closed his notebook and looked toward me. Mr. Mercer, you mentioned an attorney reviewed these notices. Rachel Sloan. What was the first thing she asked? I smiled because I could. Still picture Rachel standing at my dining room table with the HOA letter spread open in front of her. She ignored the violation notice completely. Instead, she tapped the corner of the attached map with her pen and asked a question so ordinary it almost sounded unimportant. Daniel, she said quietly, before we spend a minute discussing what this map says. She looked directly at me. Let's find out whether anyone ever had the legal authority to create it in the first place. Rachel Sloan first walked into my cabin nearly 12 years before Vanessa Whitmore ever learned my name. Back then, there wasn't an HOA dispute, a sheriff's deputy in my driveway, or a neighborhood convinced I was trespassing on my own land. Eleanor had just finished another round of chemotherapy, and for the first time in our marriage, we began talking seriously about organizing everything we'd spent a lifetime building. A retired deputy I trusted gave me Rachel's number with a simple recommendation. She doesn't impress juries, he said. She impresses county records. Rachel arrived carrying 2 banker's boxes, a legal pad, and enough colored tabs to organize a courthouse archive. She stepped inside, looked around the cabin for less than a minute, then pointed toward the old gray filing cabinet standing in the corner of my study. What's in there? She asked. Everything my father refused to throw away. She smiled. Good. Let's hope he annoyed your mother. Eleanor laughed. He absolutely did. By the end of the afternoon, our dining room table had disappeared beneath decades of paperwork. Deeds, surveys, tax records, building permits, utility easements, receipts for lumber, handwritten notes from contractors. My father, Thomas Mercer, kept almost everything. Growing up, I thought it was stubbornness. Rachel called it discipline. Most people save documents they think they'll need, she said while arranging folders by date instead of subject. Your father saved documents because he knew memory eventually loses every argument. Dad bought the property in 1978 when almost nobody wanted land this far from town. There was no Cedar Ridge, no clubhouse, no HOA, just a gravel road, thick pine forest, and a narrow emergency access trail crossing one corner of the property. Friends told him he'd overpaid for useless land. He smiled every time he heard it. They're buying today's value, he'd tell me. I'm buying tomorrow's peace. He built the cabin himself over 3 summers with help from my grandfather, 2 neighbors, and eventually me. Every cedar beam passed through our hands. Every stone in the fireplace came from the creek behind the property. When I turned 16, Dad finally trusted me to help build the dock. We measured every piling 3 separate times before driving it into the lake bed. I remember asking why we were checking the same measurements again. He rested the tape measure on his shoulder and smiled. What lets you fix mistakes? He pointed toward the shoreline. Property lines don't. At the time, I thought he was talking about construction. Years later, I realized he was talking about life. Eleanor fell in love with the cabin the first weekend I brought her there. Every Saturday morning, she carried a paperback novel and a mug of coffee to the cedar chair at the end of the dock. She always insisted the sunrise looked different from that spot. I'd tease her that the sun rose the same way everywhere. She'd smile and answer, maybe, but this is where it feels like home. After cancer took her, I stayed away from the cabin for months because every room reminded me of what I'd lost. One morning, I unlocked the front door, sat on that same dock, and finally understood something she'd been trying to tell me for years. Home isn't the place where memories hurt the least. It's the place where they're worth carrying. Rachel finished organizing the last folder just before sunset. She slid my father's original deed into a protective sleeve, closed the filing cabinet, and rested one hand on the drawer. Daniel, she said quietly, people think land is protected by fences, gates, and no trespassing signs. She shook her head. It isn't. She tapped the steel cabinet once with her knuckle. It's protected by the people who cared enough to keep the record straight. Standing on my porch years later, while an HOA president tried to convince a deputy that I didn't belong on my own property, I realized my father hadn't left me the most valuable cabin on Cedar Pine Lake. He'd left me something far more valuable than that. He'd left me a paper trail that never forgot the truth. The first certified letter from Cedar Ridge HOA arrived on a windy Tuesday afternoon in early April. I remember because I'd spent the morning replacing 2 loose cedar boards on the woodshed after a spring storm rolled across the lake. The envelope looked official enough to make most homeowners nervous. Across the front, printed in bold red letters, were the words "Final Notice." I actually laughed when I saw it. It's difficult to receive a final notice when you've never received a first one. Inside were 3 pages accusing me of violating community standards. According to the letter, my cabin's exterior color wasn't approved. My dock required an immediate HOA safety inspection. My backup generator needed to be screened from public view. Even my mailbox supposedly violated Cedar Ridge design guidelines. I read every page carefully, then read them a second time. Not because I was worried about the accusations, because every sentence quietly assumed something that had never been established. The letter never proved Cedar Ridge had authority over my property. It simply wrote as though everyone already accepted that it did. I called Rachel that afternoon. I expected her to ask about the violations. Instead, her first question caught me completely off guard. "Daniel, read me the legal description." I looked back at the letter. There isn't one. Parcel number? Yes. Recorded legal description? No. She was silent for a few seconds. Interesting. What's interesting? They're describing improvements. Another pause. They haven't identified the land they're claiming to regulate. That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. 2 weeks later, another certified envelope arrived. This one included photographs. Someone had walked well inside my property to photograph the workshop behind the cabin, the dock, the generator, and the porch where Eleanor used to keep flower boxes every spring. Those pictures weren't taken from the public road. Someone had crossed my gate. Most homeowners would have driven straight to the HOA office demanding an explanation. I didn't. 31 years wearing a badge had taught me something much more valuable than confrontation. People reveal far more when they believe nobody realizes they're being watched. Instead, I installed 2 additional security cameras. One overlooked the entrance gate. The other covered the eastern boundary where my gravel driveway met the old emergency access corridor. I also started a notebook. Every letter, every phone call, every unfamiliar vehicle, every visit, date, time, weather. Nothing dramatic, just facts. About 3 weeks later, one of the cameras sent a motion alert just after 8 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. I opened the live feed and immediately recognized Vanessa's white Range Rover. She wasn't alone. 2 maintenance employees stepped out carrying a measuring wheel, a clipboard, and several bright orange survey flags. A third man climbed out of another truck carrying a long cardboard tube used for engineering drawings. I expected them to walk toward my cabin. They didn't. I expected them to inspect the dock they'd complained about for weeks. They barely looked at it. Instead, every one of them headed toward the eastern edge of my property. The engineer unrolled a large drawing across the hood of his truck, while Vanessa pointed toward the emergency access corridor. The crew stretched measuring tape across the gravel lane several times before pushing orange flags into the ground. They spent nearly half an hour measuring the one part of my property that wasn't mentioned anywhere in the violation letters. When I drove home from town, they were still there. Vanessa greeted me with the same polished smile she'd later wear in front of Deputy Barrett. "Routine compliance inspection," she said pleasantly. I looked at the measuring wheel, then at the engineer, then toward the line of fresh survey flags. "Interesting inspection," I replied. "You haven't measured my cabin once." For the first time since we'd met, her smile didn't disappear. It froze. One of the maintenance workers slowly lowered the measuring wheel. The engineer looked at Vanessa instead of answering me. She recovered quickly. "We're documenting everything relevant to compliance." I nodded toward the orange flags running beside the emergency access corridor. "Then it's remarkable that the only thing you've measured all morning is the one place you never accused me of violating." Nobody answered. They packed their equipment and drove away a few minutes later, leaving every survey flag exactly where it stood. I photographed each one before touching nothing. Less than an hour after I emailed the photographs and security footage to Rachel, my phone rang. She didn't ask about the cabin. She didn't ask about the dock. She asked the same kind of question she'd been asking since the first letter arrived. "Daniel, if this dispute is really about HOA violations." She paused. "Why is every important measurement happening somewhere else?" From that morning forward, I stopped treating the HOA letters as complaints. I treated them as evidence. Rachel never once told me to prove Vanessa was wrong. She told me to document everything so carefully that the facts could eventually speak without either of us raising our voices. Every certified letter went into my father's filing cabinet. Every phone call was logged in my notebook. Every security recording was copied onto 2 separate hard drives. Every photograph kept its original timestamp. Good evidence doesn't become valuable because it's dramatic. It becomes valuable because no one can honestly question where it came from. About a week after the engineering crew left, another motion alert appeared on my phone just after 7 on a Wednesday morning. I opened the live camera feed while pouring my first cup of coffee. Vanessa's white Range Rover rolled through the gate again. The same engineer stepped out carrying the cardboard drawing tube. The same maintenance crew unloaded the measuring wheel. This time, however, another pickup truck followed behind them. Its doors carried the logo of a local utility locating company. That immediately caught my attention. Utility crews don't inspect paint colors. They don't measure docks. They prepare construction sites. I watched quietly as the technician sprayed temporary orange markings along the edge of the emergency access corridor. The engineer compared measurements against a large drawing spread across the hood of his truck, while Vanessa watched with obvious satisfaction. Nobody looked toward my cabin. Nobody walked onto my porch. Nobody inspected the generator, the dock, or the mailbox that supposedly violated HOA rules. Everything happened beside the corridor. 20 minutes later, I drove back from town and pulled into my driveway. The crews stopped working the moment they saw my truck. Vanessa greeted me with the same confident smile she'd worn every time we'd met. "Morning, Daniel." "Morning." I looked toward the fresh paint marks running beside the gravel lane. "Your inspections seem to be getting more expensive." She smiled politely. "We're documenting community infrastructure." "Interesting." I glanced toward my cabin. "Because every violation letter you've sent says this is about my property." She folded her arms. "It is." "Then why have I seen an engineer, survey equipment, and now a utility locating crew?" I pointed toward the orange markings. "But not one person measuring my cabin." For the first time, she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the engineer. He avoided eye contact and quietly rolled the drawing back into its tube. One of the maintenance employees removed 2 survey flags before climbing into the truck. The utility technician finished collecting his equipment without saying a word. Nobody contradicted me. Nobody explained the markings. They simply left. After the last truck disappeared around the bend, I walked the entire eastern boundary with my camera. Fresh spray paint, new survey flags, utility markings. Every single one followed the emergency access corridor. None pointed toward my house. None identified a violation. Back inside the cabin, I spread the newest photographs across the dining room table beside every HOA letter Rachel had organized. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. The accusations always pointed toward the cabin. The measurements always pointed somewhere else. Rachel arrived less than an hour later. She studied the photographs without saying a word. Then she placed them beside the earlier security images and slowly counted the orange survey flags aloud. 12, 14, 16. Finally, she looked up. "Daniel." "Yeah." She slid every photograph into a single stack. "Stop asking what they're trying to do with your cabin." "Then what should I be asking?" She looked directly at the photographs of the corridor. "Ask yourself why they're investing engineering time, survey crews, and utility locators." She paused just long enough for the question to settle. "On land they already claim belongs to them." Rachel arrived at the cabin just before 9 the following morning carrying the same weathered banker's box I'd seen years earlier when she organized my father's records. She set it on the dining room table without saying a word, looked at the growing stack of documents, photographs, and notebooks, then quietly smiled. "Your father would approve." "Of the filing system?" I asked. She shook her head. "Of the patience." Within a few minutes, the entire table disappeared beneath paperwork. My father's recorded deed, property tax statements dating back decades, county surveys, every certified HOA notice, every envelope, every security photograph, every page from my notebook. Deputy Barrett's incident report. Rachel never began with the accusations. She began with the timeline. "Evidence tells 2 stories," she said while arranging documents by date instead of subject. "One story is written in words. She placed the HOA notices into one neat stack. The other is written in behavior. She arranged the photographs beside them. Behavior is usually harder to fake. For nearly an hour, she said almost nothing. She matched inspection dates to security footage. She compared the dates on violation notices with engineering visits. She highlighted every reference to the emergency access corridor. Finally, she separated 4 HOA notices from the rest and placed them side by side. Tell me what changes. I studied them carefully. Different violation numbers. Different deadlines. Higher fines. Additional warnings. Everything, I answered. Rachel smiled faintly. Read them. Again. I did. Then I stopped. The map. Exactly. Every notice contained the exact same boundary map. Different accusations. Same attachment. 6 months had passed. The alleged violations changed. The fines changed. The inspection dates changed. The map never did. Rachel opened her laptop and logged into the Cedar County Property Records database. A few minutes later, a printer beside the kitchen counter produced a certified copy of my recorded plat. She placed it beside the HOA map without saying a word. At first glance, they appeared identical. The shoreline matched. The neighboring parcels matched. Even the curves in the access road looked almost the same. Rachel slid a clear ruler across the eastern boundary. Don't look at the cabin, she said. Look at the corridor. I leaned closer. At first, I couldn't see it. Then, almost like one of those hidden images that suddenly appears, the difference became impossible to ignore. On the county's recorded plat, the emergency access corridor remained exactly where my father's deed placed it, inside my property's legal boundary, subject only to the recorded emergency easement. On the HOA map, that same strip quietly blended into Cedar Ridge's common area. The shift was only a few feet on paper. Legally, it changed everything. Wait, I said quietly. Rachel looked at me, but didn't answer. This map. She remained silent. It's showing a different boundary. She simply nodded once. So they've been using the wrong map? Rachel folded her hands together. Maybe. I frowned. Maybe. Daniel. She looked directly at me. Never assume a document is wrong until you know why it exists. She reached into the banker's box and removed the business card from the engineering firm I'd seen at the property. I called them this morning. What did they tell you? Almost nothing. She smiled slightly, which was more than enough. I don't follow. They refused to discuss the project. She tapped the business card lightly against the table, but they confirmed one fact without realizing it, which was, she closed the folder before answering. They weren't hired to inspect a cabin. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Rachel gathered every photograph showing the survey flags beside the emergency corridor and slipped them into a new folder. Across the tab, she wrote only 3 words. Development records. Then she looked at me. This afternoon, I'm sending a preservation notice to Cedar Ridge's attorney. Asking for what? Every engineering drawing. Every planning file. Every version of that map. Every board meeting minute that mentions your property. I looked once more at the 2 maps lying side by side on my dining room table. Do you think they'll actually send all of that? Rachel closed the banker's box with a soft click. If they're convinced they've been right all along. She rested one hand on the folder labeled Development Records. They won't realize they've just told us where the real story has been hiding. 3 days after Rachel mailed the preservation notice, Deputy Luke Barrett called and asked if he could stop by the cabin. His voice sounded different this time. Not official. Curious. You have a few minutes? He asked. Always. He arrived just after lunch carrying a thin county file instead of the thick incident folder he'd brought before. We sat on the porch overlooking Cedar Pine Lake while he placed 2 documents on the small cedar table between us. I kept thinking about one question, he admitted. I smiled. The parcel number. He nodded. I verified it. Without another word, he slid the first page toward me. It was the original HOA violation notice Vanessa had handed him the morning she tried to have me removed. Then he placed a certified county assessor's parcel summary beside it. Don't read everything, he said. Just read the first line. At first glance, the numbers looked identical. Then I saw it. 4 digits near the beginning didn't match. One small difference. Easy to miss. Impossible to ignore once someone pointed it out. I assumed it was a typo, Luke said. Then I checked the second notice. He laid another violation letter beside the first. Same parcel number. Then another. Same number again. Then another. Every notice Cedar Ridge had mailed over 6 months carried the exact same parcel identification. Luke leaned back in his chair. Typos move around. He tapped the stack of letters. This one never did. I looked across the lake for several seconds before asking the question both of us already knew mattered. Who does that parcel belong to? Luke opened the county file again and handed me another record. Vacant shoreline still owned by the original developer. Different owner. Different tax account. Different legal description. Different property entirely. The only connection to my cabin existed inside the HOA's paperwork. Neither of us spoke. Small waves tapped quietly against the dock my father and I had built decades earlier. Finally, Luke broke the silence. After I left your place that morning, I called the county recorder. That surprised me. What did they find? Every recorded document connected to your parcel. He counted them off with one finger. Original deed. Tax history. Survey revisions. Easement records. Then he looked directly at me. No annexation. Another finger. No transfer of ownership. Another. No recorded instrument placing Mercer Cabin inside Cedar Ridge HOA. I nodded slowly. Rachel had been asking the right questions from the very beginning. Luke closed the file, but didn't stand up. Instead, he looked toward the eastern tree line where the emergency access corridor disappeared into the pines. Here's the part one still can't explain. What's that? If the county record never changed. He paused. Why did the HOA keep escalating after you challenged the parcel number? It was exactly the question Rachel had asked after reading the lien notice. Honest mistakes usually become smaller once someone points them out. This one kept becoming more expensive. More engineers. More survey crews. More legal letters. More pressure. The mistake wasn't shrinking. It was being defended. Luke reached into his shirt pocket and handed me a business card. Across the back, he'd written one name in blue ink. Helen Price. Deputy County Surveyor, he said. I called her yesterday. Did she know about the dispute? Not until I asked about your parcel. He smiled slightly. She asked me one question before she'd answer anything else. What was it? Luke looked down at the stack of HOA notices still lying on the table between us. She asked whether the association was relying on a recorded survey. He paused just long enough for the silence to settle. Or on a developer's planning map. Deputy Barrett's visit changed the way I looked at the entire dispute. Up until then, I'd assumed Cedar Ridge was defending a mistake. But mistakes usually become smaller once someone points them out. This one kept growing. Rachel reached the same conclusion before I did. Watch what happens next, she said during a phone call that evening. If this began as an honest clerical error, they'll quietly correct it. She paused. If they don't, I finished the sentence myself. Then the paperwork isn't what they're protecting. Exactly. 4 days later, another certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was noticeably thicker than the others. Across the front, bold black letters read Notice of Intent TO File Lien. According to Cedar Ridge, I now owed more than $18,000 in accumulated fines, inspection fees, administrative costs, attorney expenses, and unpaid assessments. If I failed to pay within 15 days, the association intended to record a lien against my property. I read the letter once. Then I read it again. Something felt different, although I couldn't immediately explain why. I called Rachel. Read it to me, she said. I read every page aloud without interruption. When I finished, she remained silent. Anything? I asked. Read the last 2 pages again. I did. Halfway through the second reading I stopped. Wait. Rachel didn't answer. She knew I'd found it myself. They never mentioned the cabin. No. They never mentioned the paint. No. They never mentioned the dock. No. Or the mailbox. No. She finally spoke. The violations that supposedly justified 6 months of enforcement have disappeared. I looked back through the letter. She was right. It threatened legal action, collection costs, interest, attorneys, liens, deadlines. But the alleged violations themselves were almost gone. The argument had quietly shifted away from community standards and toward control of the property itself. That's not an enforcement letter anymore, Rachel said. It's leverage. Less than an hour later, my phone rang again. Vanessa. Her voice sounded as confident as it had the morning she stood in my front yard. Daniel, this is your final opportunity to resolve this privately. Resolve what? I asked. Accept Cedar Ridge's authority, satisfy the outstanding balance, and allow our contractors unrestricted access to the property. Contractors. The word slipped out so naturally that I almost missed it. There was a brief pause before she corrected herself. Inspection team. I quietly wrote the first word in my notebook anyway. 31 years in law enforcement had taught me never to ignore the first version of an answer. People usually correct themselves when they're thinking about appearances instead of facts. And if I decline? I asked. Then our attorneys will proceed. Her tone remained calm, almost reassuring. Nobody wants this to become more expensive. I looked through the kitchen window toward the emergency access corridor where the survey flags still stood. Seems to me, I said quietly, someone's already spending a great deal of money on something they claim they already own. For the first time since the conversation began, Vanessa didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her words were careful. You'll understand soon enough what's really at stake. Then she ended the call. 20 minutes later, Rachel called back after reading the letter I'd scanned to her office. Daniel, she said. The HOA attorney finally responded to my preservation notice. Did he send the documents? Not yet. Then what did he send? A request for more time. Why? Rachel looked down at the letter in front of her. Because gathering the responsive records requires collecting engineering files, planning committee documents, development proposals, infrastructure studies, board meeting minutes, and correspondence going back several years. She stopped reading. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Finally, she asked the question that changed the entire direction of the investigation. Daniel, how does a dispute over one retired sheriff's cabin suddenly require years of development and engineering records? Rachel called just after 8 the following morning. She skipped her usual greeting, which was unusual enough to tell me she'd found something important. Daniel, she said, the HOA attorney finally sent me something useful. I leaned back in my chair. The records? Not yet. Then what? An inventory. I frowned. An inventory of what? Everything they're collecting in response to my preservation notice. At first, I didn't understand why that mattered. Rachel seemed to expect that. Most lawyers read documents, she said. I read the labels on the boxes they're trying to protect. I heard papers sliding across her desk before she continued. Marina expansion planning. A page turned. Emergency corridor evaluation. Another page. Future shoreline integration proposal. Another. Infrastructure access study. Then silence. Notice anything? She asked. I thought about the titles for several seconds. None of them mentioned my cabin. Exactly. She didn't sound excited. Rachel never celebrated before she understood the whole picture. For 6 months, the HOA insisted this was about architectural violations. Yet almost every file they're preserving concerns future development. I walked to the kitchen window and looked toward the eastern edge of my property where the emergency access corridor disappeared into the pine trees. Suddenly, every engineering visit, every survey flag, every utility marking, and every measurement lined up into a single pattern. None of them had ever focused on my cabin. They'd always focused on the corridor. I also met with Helen Price this morning, Rachel continued. The deputy county surveyor? Yes. Did she recognize the HOA map? Immediately. Rachel paused, but not the way I expected. I turned away from the window. What do you mean? She didn't identify it as a survey. Another pause. She identified it as a planning exhibit. I felt my pulse quicken. The same phrase the engineer almost used. Exactly. Rachel opened another folder. Helen pulled the original development file from the county archives. I waited. The map Vanessa keeps carrying wasn't created to establish ownership. She chose each word carefully. It was created years before Cedar Ridge was built to illustrate what the subdivision could look like if additional property were ever acquired in the future. I sat down without realizing it. So, Rachel finished the thought for me. It's a concept drawing. Silence filled the room. I looked across the dining table where my father's deed lay beside the county survey. Both had been recorded. Both carried official references. Both described the property exactly as it existed. The HOA map did neither. Then why has every board treated it like a legal boundary? I asked quietly. Rachel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked me another question. Daniel, do you remember what Deputy Barrett said after he verified the parcel number? I nodded. If the county record never changed, why did the HOA keep escalating? Exactly. She let the words settle before continuing. People don't usually defend a concept drawing this aggressively unless something else depends on it. I looked back toward the emergency access corridor. The development plans. That's my theory. She emphasized the last two words. Not my conclusion. Rachel almost never offered theories. When she did, she immediately returned to evidence. There's still one document we haven't seen, she said. What's that? I asked. She turned another page inside Helen Price's archive index. Halfway down, one entry had been highlighted in yellow. Rachel read it slowly. Emergency Access Agreement. Recorded June 14, 1996. I recognized the title immediately. Helen has a copy? Not yet. Rachel's voice became quieter. The original is still sealed in the county recorder's archives. Can we request it? Already have. Another brief silence. Daniel. Yeah. Planning exhibits can imagine almost anything. She closed the file. Recorded agreements can't. Then she said the one sentence I would think about for the next 48 hours. I don't believe we're looking for another map anymore. She paused. I think we're looking for the one document every map was supposed to follow. The county scheduled the formal review for the following Thursday. Rachel didn't spend the next several days preparing arguments. She prepared questions. If we walk into that room expecting to persuade people, she told me, we've already misunderstood our job. My dining room slowly transformed into something that looked less like a cabin and more like a county records office. Every document occupied its own folder. My father's original 1978 deed, property tax records, recorded surveys, certified mail receipts, every HOA violation notice, every security photograph, every page from my notebook, Deputy Barrett's incident report, county parcel records, Helen Price's archive index. Rachel arranged everything chronologically across the table until 6 months of confusion became one uninterrupted timeline. Good cases aren't built from dramatic evidence, she said while placing colored tabs along the edge of another folder. They're built from ordinary documents that refuse to contradict each other. By Wednesday afternoon, every piece fit. The first HOA letter, the repeated parcel number, the inspections that never focused on the cabin, the engineer, the survey crews, the utility markings, the planning exhibit, the county plat, Deputy Barrett's verification, Helen Price's archive research. Every answer quietly supported the next question. Rachel placed the HOA planning exhibit beside the county's recorded survey one final time. Tell me what each document is trying to do, she said. I studied them carefully before answering. The survey records reality. I pointed toward the planning exhibit. This one predicts what reality might become. Rachel smiled. Exactly. She tapped the survey. One records ownership. Then she tapped the planning exhibit. The other assumes a future that only happens if someone acquires additional property. She looked back at me. Assumptions aren't illegal. She paused. Treating them like recorded facts is where people get into trouble. Late that afternoon, another certified envelope arrived from Cedar Ridge's attorney. Rachel opened it while I made coffee. It wasn't the production she'd requested. It was a witness list and exhibit list for the county review. Community bylaws. Architectural guidelines. Board. Resolutions. Inspection photographs. The laminated boundary map. Rachel read the list twice before quietly placing it on the table. Notice what's missing? She asked. I looked through the pages. The emergency access agreement. Exactly. Another pause. If that agreement supported the HOA's position. She looked up. It would be the first exhibit on this list. Neither of us said anything for several seconds. We didn't need to. Sometimes missing evidence says more than evidence itself. Rachel then reached for a plain brown county archive envelope resting by itself on the corner of the table. The recorder's seal remained unbroken. The chain of custody form was still attached to the front. She checked the reference number one last time before carefully placing it inside our file box. I looked at the sealed envelope. You know what's in there, don't you? She slowly shook her head. I know what the archive says should be in there. You haven't opened it? No. Why? Rachel smiled faintly. Because if this is the original recorded agreement. She rested her hand lightly on the seal. It deserves to be opened exactly once. Tomorrow? I asked. Tomorrow. She closed the file box, switched off the dining room light, and walked toward the front door. Before stepping outside, she stopped and looked back at the cabin. Daniel. Yeah. When Deputy Barrett first arrived, she smiled. You asked whether anyone had verified the parcel number. I nodded. Tomorrow, she said quietly. We're going to find out whether anyone ever verified the map. The county review wasn't held in a courtroom. It took place in a plain conference room inside the Cedar County Administration Building, where faded government paint covered the walls and fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead. There were no spectators, no jury, and no dramatic speeches waiting to happen. Property disputes rarely end with emotion. They usually end when someone places the right document on the right table. Representatives from the county planning office sat along one side of the room. Deputy County Surveyor Helen Price carefully arranged several rolled surveys beside a county plat book. Rachel and I sat opposite them with one file box containing 6 months of evidence. Vanessa Whitmore arrived carrying the same leather portfolio she'd marched across my front yard with the morning she called the sheriff's office. 2 HOA board members followed her inside, along with Cedar Ridge's outside attorney. Everyone looked confident. Everyone believed their paperwork would survive the morning. The planning director opened the meeting with a single sentence. Our purpose today is to determine which recorded documents establish jurisdiction over the Mercer property. No one argued. The HOA attorney stood first. He placed the familiar laminated community map in the center of the table and calmly explained that Cedar Ridge had relied upon it since the subdivision was created. He spoke about consistency, long-standing practice, community reliance. When he finished, Rachel stood without carrying a single sheet of paper. Instead, she nodded toward Helen Price. Helen unrolled the county's certified survey until it stretched almost the entire length of the table. Rachel then placed my father's recorded 1978 deed beside it. "Would you compare the legal descriptions?" she asked. Helen did exactly that. Every bearing matched. Every monument matched. Every property line matched. Rachel quietly laid the HOA map beside the survey. "Now compare the eastern boundary." Helen followed the boundary with one finger across the recorded survey. Then she moved to the HOA map. Halfway along the emergency access corridor, her finger stopped. She didn't say anything for several seconds. Finally, she looked up. "The corridor shifts." Rachel nodded once. "Only on one document." Vanessa leaned forward immediately. "That roadway has always served Cedar Ridge." "Yes," Rachel answered calmly. "It has." She reached into our file box and removed the sealed county archive envelope that had remained unopened since arriving from the recorder's office. She placed it gently in front of the planning director. "The issue isn't who has used the road," she said. "The issue is what the recorded agreement actually granted." The room became perfectly silent. The planning director examined the county seal, confirmed the archive reference number, and carefully broke the envelope open. He unfolded the original document inside and read the heading twice before speaking aloud. "Emergency Access Agreement. Recorded June 14, 1996. Nobody moved. A limited emergency access easement is hereby granted to Cedar County for fire protection, emergency vehicle access, and evacuation purposes only." He turned the page. "No ownership interest is conveyed to the developer, any homeowners association, successor organization, or private entity." Vanessa's confident posture stiffened. The planning director continued reading. "This agreement shall not be interpreted as modifying recorded property boundaries, parcel ownership, governance authority, or future subdivision jurisdiction." Helen quietly compared the agreement with the certified survey, then with my father's deed. She looked toward the planning director and gave one slow nod. "Every recorded document agrees." Rachel finally placed one last exhibit on the table. The certified parcel record Deputy Barrett had personally verified after visiting my cabin. The planning director compared the parcel number on the county record with the number printed across every HOA violation notice. Different parcel, different legal description, different owner. He removed his reading glasses, folded them carefully, and looked directly at Vanessa. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said in the same calm voice he'd used all morning, "Mercer Cabin has never been part of Cedar Ridge HOA." Nobody spoke. The HOA attorney quietly closed his notebook. One board member lowered his eyes to the table. Even Vanessa didn't argue. For 6 months, everyone had defended the same map. Not one of them had stopped to ask the question Deputy Barrett asked on the very first morning. Had anyone actually verified it? Rachel slowly gathered the documents back into the file box while the planning director signed the county's written determination. As he placed his signature on the final page, he looked up one last time. "This dispute," he said quietly, was never resolved by finding new evidence. He rested his pen beside the file. It was resolved by finally trusting the evidence that had been recorded all along. The county's determination reached Cedar Ridge before the certified copy ever arrived in the association office. By the following Tuesday evening, every parking space outside the clubhouse was full. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the entrance road. Homeowners stood in small groups beneath the oak trees, quietly comparing violation notices, emails, and rumors that had spread through the neighborhood over the past week. 6 months earlier, many of them had believed I was refusing to follow the rules. Tonight, they had come for a different reason. They wanted to know how an HOA could spend half a year enforcing authority it never legally possessed. Rachel and I arrived a few minutes before the meeting began. She carried one accordion file containing certified copies of the county determination. I carried nothing. There was no reason to. The record had already spoken. Vanessa Whitmore entered the clubhouse exactly on time, carrying the same leather portfolio she'd brought to my cabin. She walked to the front of the room with the confidence that had defined every encounter we'd ever had. But something had changed. The conversation stopped when she entered. Not because people respected her authority, because they were waiting to hear how she would explain losing it. She adjusted the microphone. Good evening, everyone. Before we begin tonight's agenda, I'd like to address recent confusion regarding the county's review. An older homeowner near the front stood before she could continue. Was it confusion? He asked calmly. Or were we enforcing rules on property that never belonged to the HOA? The room became completely silent. Vanessa answered without hesitation. The county adopted a different interpretation of several historical records. Before another word left her mouth, Cedar Ridge's outside attorney slowly stood from his chair. For the record, he said evenly, the county did not issue an interpretation. Every eye turned toward him. It confirmed the recorded property record. Nobody whispered. Nobody interrupted. He continued, Mercer Cabin has never been subject to Cedar Ridge HOA jurisdiction. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument I'd heard over the previous 6 months. Rachel walked to the front only after the board secretary recognized her. She placed 4 documents across the conference table without commentary. My father's recorded deed, the certified county survey, the emergency access agreement, the developer's planning exhibit. Then she stepped back. These 4 documents answered every question, she said quietly. 3 established legal fact. 1 illustrated a future that never became legal reality. She didn't identify which one was different. She didn't have to. Everyone in the room already knew. The board secretary then read the county's written determination into the official minutes. Every sentence sounded almost ordinary. Recorded deed. Recorded survey. Recorded easement. No transfer of ownership. No HOA jurisdiction. The simplicity made the outcome even more powerful. Months of assumptions collapsed beneath a few paragraphs of verified records. Then the homeowners began asking questions. Why weren't county records checked before enforcement started? Why did the board continue issuing notices after Mr. Mercer challenged the parcel number? Why were engineers surveying the emergency corridor instead of inspecting the alleged violations? Vanessa answered each question the same way she had answered Deputy Barrett weeks earlier. She referred back to the community map. Each time she did, someone else referred back to the county record. The balance of authority had completely shifted. Confidence no longer carried more weight than verification. Treasurer Richard Cole slowly stood. Based upon the county's findings, he said, I move that this board immediately rescind every violation notice, assessment, inspection demand, attorney fee, and threatened lien issued against Mercer Cabin. Before he sat down, another board member spoke. Second, Richard remained standing. I also move that Vanessa Whitmore be removed as president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association for authorizing enforcement without verifying recorded ownership. Second, the vote wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. One by one, board members raised their hands. The motions passed by an overwhelming majority. Vanessa quietly closed her leather portfolio. For the first time since she'd stepped onto my property months earlier, she didn't argue. She simply gathered her papers, nodded once to the remaining board members, and walked out of the clubhouse without looking back. After the meeting, the board chair asked whether I wished to address the membership. I walked to the front of the room and looked at the same neighbors who had watched Deputy Barrett pull into my driveway that spring morning. "I don't want anyone embarrassed," I said, "and I don't need anyone to apologize." I paused, letting the room settle. "I only want one promise." The board chair nodded. "Name it." I looked toward the framed community map still hanging on the clubhouse wall. "The next time someone says they own a piece of land." I glanced around the room before finishing the sentence that had quietly guided the entire investigation. "Verify the record before you verify the story." Nobody applauded. They simply nodded. Somehow, that meant even more. 3 months later, Cedar Pine Lake looked exactly the way it had on the morning this entire story began. The mist still drifted across the water before sunrise. The old dock still creaked beneath my boots. Pine trees still reflected across the surface so perfectly that, on calm mornings, it was difficult to tell where the shoreline ended and the sky began. Nature had ignored every certified letter, every board meeting, every legal threat, and every argument. It simply waited for people to finish disagreeing before reminding them that some things never needed defending in the first place. Life around Cedar Ridge, however, had quietly changed. The new HOA board mailed every homeowner a revised community boundary packet prepared directly from the county's recorded surveys instead of the old planning exhibit. A new policy required every future enforcement action involving disputed property to begin with a verified county parcel search before a single violation notice could be issued. It wasn't presented as a victory. It was presented as a correction. The process everyone assumed had existed all along finally did. A separate certified letter arrived at my cabin a week later. Inside was a formal resolution rescinding every violation notice, inspection demand, assessment, attorney fee, and threatened lien ever issued against Mercer Cabin. The final paragraph contained only one sentence that mattered. The Mercer property has never been subject to the jurisdiction of Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. 6 months of conflict had ended with 21 words. Richard Cole stopped by one Saturday morning carrying a thermos of black coffee instead of a folder full of paperwork. We sat together at the end of the dock, watching the lake wake up around us. After several minutes, he finally spoke. "I've been thinking about that map." I smiled. "So have I." He shook his head slowly. "It wasn't really the map, was it?" "No, it was us." I looked across the water before answering. "A map only becomes dangerous when people stop asking where it came from." He nodded quietly. "I won't make that mistake again." A few days later, Deputy Luke Barrett drove out to the cabin one final time to close his incident report. We stood beside the porch where he'd first opened Vanessa's folder months earlier. He looked toward the driveway and laughed softly. "You know what I remember most?" "What?" "The first question you asked me." I smiled. "Did anyone verify the parcel number?" "Exactly." He looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. That question probably saved me from making the biggest mistake of my career. I shook my head. "The parcel number didn't save my cabin." He waited. "Verifying it did." Luke smiled, repeating the sentence quietly to himself as though he intended to remember it for the rest of his career. "I'll be using that one." Rachel never celebrated. That wasn't who she was. A few days after the county meeting, she mailed me one final envelope containing a certified copy of the county's written determination along with a handwritten note clipped to the front. It read, "Records don't exist because people expect honesty. They exist because confidence is never evidence." I framed the note and hung it above the same gray filing cabinet my father had, filled over decades. Inside were the 1978 deed, every recorded survey, the emergency access agreement, every HOA letter, every security photograph, every page of my notebook, and finally the county's determination. Together, they told one uninterrupted story without a single contradiction. On the first cool morning of autumn, I finally repaired the loose arm on Eleanor's favorite cedar chair at the end of the dock. I'd been promising myself I'd do it for years. I carried out a fresh cup of coffee, sat where she always watched the sunrise, and listened to the quiet settle across the lake. I could almost hear her voice again. "Truth doesn't become stronger because people believe it," she'd once told me. "It simply waits for someone willing to look." Looking across the water, I realized she had been talking about much more than property. Every now and then someone asks whether I feel satisfied knowing the HOA president lost her position. The truth is, I rarely think about Vanessa anymore. I think about my father measuring every property line twice before driving the first dock piling into the lake bed. I think about Rachel refusing to assume before she verified. I think about Deputy Barrett choosing evidence over certainty. Most of all, I think about one simple question asked on an ordinary spring morning that quietly changed everything. Before anyone tells you who owns a piece of land, verify the parcel number. Better yet, verify the record. Because confidence can persuade a neighborhood. Assumptions can survive for years. But the truth has an extraordinary habit of waiting patiently inside the public record until someone finally decides to read it.